We've talked plenty about kilns. Now I want to talk about glaze, and specifically where glaze came from. So glaze, people didn't, as we know, people didn't start by glazing all of their pottery. We have lots of examples of pottery that's not been glazed. It's used slip or the effects of smoke as the decoration, and there wasn't this shiny added stuff. Well, one of the ways that glaze developed was from ash from the wood kiln, and we're going to talk about that. The other way that glaze developed is that people experimented with mixing materials, locally available materials, into either their clays. In Egypt, we have faience, which is essentially a clay and glaze mixed together, so the clay itself kind of melts. And then we have other materials in other parts of the world that end up, artists discover that they melt, or discover that in combination with other materials they melt, and they produce the effects that they want to see. So let's start with ash. And I should zoom back a second. This piece here has ash on it. The ash from the wood kiln. So the kiln is fueled with wood. The wood, as it burns, creates ash, and because it's a really violent atmosphere inside the kiln, that ash flies through the air inside the kiln and lands on pots. Now, if it just lands on the side of the pot, it looks like this. So this is a heavily ashed pot that was fired in a wood kiln, probably an anagama type kiln, because an updraft type kiln, you don't have as much ash just landing directly on the stuff. This is probably a piece that is set towards the front of the kiln, and like I said, the ash hits the pot and stops. Now, in these two examples here, we see effects we can see the directionality of the ash, and essentially we can see how one side of the pot got hit. The ash then, once it hits, if you keep firing the kiln, it'll start to melt down the side of the pot. And so the arrows point to where the ash basically hit, and then it continued melting. On the left, you can see these drips, and that is because this ash, this material in the wood ash, melts, creates this shiny surface, but it doesn't really have anything mixed into it to keep it from melting, so it'll just keep running down the side of the pot. Now, one of the interesting things about firing a wood kiln is that ash is going to land on anything that's exposed. And so if you have your pots stacked on top of a shelf or on top of each other with nothing in between them, they're going to melt, and the ash is going to hit them, and the ash is just going to keep melting until it sticks down the side of the pot. So here we have an example where somebody has used pieces of shells, just literally shells off the beach. And they've put them, this pot was actually on its side. It was not standing up the way we're looking at it now, but it was fired on its side. And so those shells kept it from sticking to either another pot or a shelf. And you can see where the glaze has run down. And the glaze here is running down, not to the side. You actually can have glaze that runs to the side because the atmosphere in the kiln is so violent that it basically forces it sideways. But in this case, we can tell that the pot was fired on its side. So that ash has run down. When it got to the shell, it ran onto the shell. But the shell, during the firing, calcifies and basically goes away. It just becomes bits, dust. And so when you unload the kiln, you basically brush away what used to be a shell. Some potters use wadding and things like that, other materials like wads of clay dipped in alumina to keep them from sticking. And some potters, like we see, choose to leave the ash visible, have the ash run down the side of the pot, or they can actually turn the ash into a glaze. And Steve Robeson, who teaches up at Central, he and his wife firework, or at least used to firework when they weren't in the desert, that's wood-fired. And so the ash effect you can see on the surface of his pot. Here I've got a zoomed-in picture of what that ash can look like. And so ash glaze is developed literally by people just, scooping up some ash, whether it's from the kiln or whether it's from the campfire or the cooking fire or whatever chimney or fireplace in their house. That ash gets mixed with, at the very simplest version, just with water, Or in a more complex version, you might mix the ash with clay. And so now you've created a glaze. And so the ash is providing you the flux. The clay provides the silica and the clay to stick things together. And then the ash is also providing the colorants. Depending what kind of wood you're burning, you're going to get different effects with that ash, excuse me. And so burn a beech tree versus a ash versus ashes gets confusing, right? Versus a maple tree. And you're going to get different stuff out of that. If you're familiar with terroir in winemaking, the place the tree grew can matter as well. That the tree basically brings in nutrients from the ground or chemicals from the ground, I should say, and that'll affect the look of the glaze as well. So the trouble with ash glazes is that they can be really runny, and so today, usually when people are using ash glazes that they've applied, they may add some stuff to them to help keep them suspended, essentially to cut down on how much they melt, how fluxy they are, but ash glazes are still used today. Now I want to switch gears and talk about another type of glaze, a material in glaze that's really popular, and that is lead glaze. And lead glaze is one we often get asked about as potters because people are familiar with it. People know that glazes have had lead in them and continue to have lead in them today. And so they have questions about it, right? Now, why does lead get used in glaze? Well, the answer is pretty simple, and unsurprisingly, it has to do with how cheap and how plentiful this material is and how easy it is to use. So it allows artists to fire to a lower temperature than the wood firings we were just looking at with the ash glazes. And it allows them to fire to create these bright colors. So bright greens, oranges, reds, some of these very bright colors that we prize in ceramics, particularly in decorative ceramics, right? Now, the problem is, as you know, that we knew, like potters in 8th century China knew that this lead glaze was bad for them. It's just that it was also good for them in that it allowed them to make a living, right? They could outdo the competitors, or they could sell their stuff. And so potters have basically always known, or for many centuries have known that lead is bad for you. We don't use it now. We don't have any in the studio. I've never allowed any when I've been in charge of the studio, and that's because it's just too toxic. Like particularly with a group of a bunch of different people working, and some people have read the directions and some haven't. Right? It's too dangerous. And generally in the U.S., potters don't use lead glazes. Now, the trouble is that the reasons to use it continue to be important. So if you're buying mass-produced pottery, particularly if it's coming from China, which is less well regulated, there's still lots of potteries in Mexico that use lead. And again, the reasons to use the lead are still the same. It's cheap, it's plentiful, it allows you bright colors, and you don't have to fire it quite as hot. Today, there are fritted leads and lead alternatives. There's industrial colors that can allow us to get these bright colors. But it's really important if you're buying functional work, it's important for you to be aware that if the stuff is coming in if it's really cheap, if it's coming in unregulated, if it's, not got some sort of oversight or guarantee that it's not got lead in it, then it might have lead in it. And the problem with eating and drinking out of stuff with lead glaze in is that the lead, if it's not fritted or if it's not made stable in some way, that lead can get into your food and you can end up consuming it. It'll make you go crazy. Eventually it'll kill you. In fact, years ago, and my data's, my dates for this are way back, but years ago I was watching one of those like 2020 investigative journalism things, and they were talking about lead in like mass-produced coffee cups and stuff like that. And they went around the office and they tested all the people's cups. The cup, I drink out of handmade cups. I know who made my cups. But they were drinking out of, I hate Mondays and I'm best father, cups like that. And just mass-produced stuff. And they found that the majority of them, and I've forgotten what the numbers are now, but the majority of them actually had lead in them. And so my recommendation for all of you is that you know the stuff you're making and the glazes you're using don't include lead. And so you should make your own, or you should buy from local artists who you know or you've talked to, and they don't, they don't include lead in them, so you don't have that risk. Now, there are lots of other ingredients in glazes, and those glazes, potters use lots of different materials in their glazes now. When we mix our glazes in the YVC Clay Studio, we are, and I should say, if you're taking this class online, we're using pre-mixed glazes that were mixed in Tacoma by Clay Art Center in Tacoma, or by another company that we bought them for. But at YVC, we mix our own glazes for the Cone 10 firings. And those glazes have a lot of different materials that we mix into them. We use these basic materials, but there's lots of variations in them. So we use silica, which is the material that forms glass. It's the stuff that melts. Clay has silica in it, but we usually add additional silica to the glaze. We add flux, which is the stuff that helps the silica to melt. The silica by itself won't melt at a super low temperature that we fire to, so we add that material to it. We also add clay, and the clay helps it stick to the pot, and then we add things like oxides, opacifiers, things to add color, things to make the glaze opaque, things to make the glaze thicker, and then of course the other one we add is water, right, so that it will be able to put it on our pot. It'll be a liquid that we can dip or spray or paint. The picture I have here shows you kind of a oversimplified drawing of a cross-section of what's happening here. If you take glaze and you just stick it on a pot and fire it, it's not going to stick. Because it's not got the clay in it, it's not going to actually get absorbed and mix with your clay. Because of both how we apply it and the fact that it's got some clay in there, we end up getting essentially the clay and then the sticking together layer and then the layer of glass on the top. And so that's what my little illustration is meant to say. Now, all of those factors about the silica and the flux and the clay and the oxides, those help us decide when we're mixing glazes what the glaze formulation will be. And so we mix glazes at YVC, and we take into account these different factors. We care about what melting temperature it is. That's really important because that's what we're firing to. So if the glaze melts at cone 10, that's going to work for us. If it melts at cone 6, it's going to be a puddle by the time it gets out of cone 10. And so we need to control the melting temperature. We also need to control the texture. And of course, if a glaze melts at cone 10 and we fire it to cone 6, it's going to have a different temperature. It won't, texture. It won't have melted, and so it'll be kind of rough and crusty or whatever. And we can also, at cone 10, control for textures that are bumpy, textures that are smooth, textures that are very shiny or more matte. Of course, we want to deal with color, so we're making a red or a green or a purple glaze, right? And then opacity. Opacity is whether we can see through it, whether it's a semi-transparent, a transparent, clear, or a more opaque glaze. Now, some of these are affected by atmosphere. Some of these are affected by the type of clay, the clay body that we're working on. And of course, some of these, all of these are affected by both the temperature that we fire it to and the how well it's applied. So applying a glaze thicker or thinner may change it as well. But all of those factors can be also built into the design of the glaze and the raw materials used in it, in its formulation.